At 6:15 on the morning of July 19, 1944, Corporal James Mitchell crouched behind a ridge overlooking Posawali Harbor in Italy, watching German artillery decimate the third Allied landing wave in 18 minutes. 24 years old, 19 months of training, one previous combat operation, but he'd never seen anything like this. The Germans had positioned a single Mark VI howitzer, 105 millimeters, inside a reinforced concrete emplacement carved into the cliffs above the bay. The gun crew had already destroyed 3 transport ships and crippled 5 destroyers. 17,000 Allied soldiers were crowded on the beaches below, pinned down in the surf, unable to move forward or back. The operation to secure the Italian mainland was collapsing in real time. A single weapon was doing what an entire division should have required. Mitchell had been born in Philadelphia in 1920, son of a dock worker, 2 years of high school. Then the steel mills, until his draft notice came in December 1942, he'd never held a rifle before enlisting. The training had been relentless Fort Dix, then advanced artillery school at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Then 3 months in North Africa, watching older men die from mistakes he was determined not to make. His unit, Battery C, 27th Field Artillery Regiment, had landed at Salerno 6 weeks earlier. They were supposed to be firing support for the infantry. Instead, they spent the last hour watching their own men get slaughtered by German guns they could reach, couldn't suppress, couldn't touch. The original landing plan called for surprise, hit the beaches at dawn, secure the high ground, move inland before German reinforcements arrived. Intelligence said the Germans had maybe 40 defenders in the Posawali sector. The Mark VI howitzer changed everything. The gun sat in a concrete bunker cut into the cliffside, its barrel pointing directly at the beach. The crew had camouflaged it with netting and coastal vegetation. American aircraft had been flying reconnaissance for weeks. They'd missed it completely. The approach routes were mined. The position was nearly impregnable from the sea. Worse, it was nearly invisible from the beach. The first landing craft touched sand at 0615. The Germans waited until 15 vessels were unloading men and equipment. Then they opened fire. The first shell hit the largest transport broadside. The explosion erupted through the hull, fire spreading across the deck. Men were jumping, swimming, drowning in water that was already turning red. The second shot went through the command vessel. Officers were still inside. They were still planning the assault. Now they were just gone. By 0633, 2 ships were sinking. Another 3 were damaged enough that they'd have to pull back. The beach was chaos. Wounded men were staggering up the sand. Dead men were being pulled back into the water. Officers were trying to organize their units, trying to get men moving inland, trying to salvage an operation that was collapsing in front of them. Mitchell watched from his observation post. He'd been assigned to coordinate artillery support, which meant he watched things happen and called in fire requests that couldn't reach the target. The Mark VI was too high, too well protected, too far back to hit with mortar. Naval gunfire couldn't get a good angle without hitting their own troops. Aircraft had been called, but they were 20 minutes out, if they came at all. The beach was dying in real time, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The gun fired again, 8th shot in 20 minutes. The shell went right through a landing craft full of engineers. 50 men had been inside. There were no survivors. Mitchell counted the empty landing craft drifting back to sea, counted the men in the water, made rough estimates of the casualties. 17,000 were supposed to land. Maybe 12,000 had made it ashore. The rest were still offshore, waiting in transport ships, circling in landing craft. Trapped outside the perimeter that kept collapsing every time the Mark VI fired, Colonel Harrison Webb radioed from the beach. He was the divisional commander, which meant he was responsible for this disaster. He wanted the gun silenced, wanted it now, didn't care how. Mitchell's commander, Major Louis Carver, looked at the coordinates, looked at the bunker, looked at the gun crew positioning a new shell into the breach. Carver was older, a regular Army officer from the previous war, a man who'd seen artillery do impossible things before, if men were willing to pay the price. He looked at Mitchell. "You know that position?" Mitchell nodded. He'd been studying it through binoculars for 3 days. "Can we reach it with anything we have? Not with artillery? Not without hitting the town? Not without causing civilian casualties that would end careers? What about direct action?" Mitchell understood what Carver was asking. Carver was asking him if one man could reach that bunker, asking if one man would try. asking if Mitchell was willing to die to stop that gun from killing the 17,000 men on the beach. Mitchell had been raised Catholic, had said his prayers every night since basic training, had written letters home every week explaining what he was doing, where he was, how he was trying to stay alive. His mother had written back asking him to be careful, asking him to come home, asking him if he understood how many boys she'd already lost in this war. She'd already buried one son. She didn't want to bury another. Mitchell looked at the bunker, looked at the beach, watched the gunfire again. Another landing craft took damage. More men were dying. Men he'd trained with, men from his hometown, men who were 18 years old, same age he'd been when he enlisted. He turned to Carver. "I'll try." Carver didn't ask if Mitchell was sure, didn't offer him any other options, just nodded and said they'd provide covering fire. Mitchell gathered his gearful, for grenades, a combat knife, 17 rounds of ammunition. He also took a hammer and chisel. He didn't know if they'd be useful, just instinct. Soldiers ran on instinct in this war. The bunker was 300 yards up the cliff face. There were switchback paths carved into the rock, probably used for supply runs, probably mined, probably covered by secondary positions. Mitchell couldn't take the paths, he'd be spotted. He had to go straight up, using the rock face itself, climbing like a man trying to reach a mountain cabin instead of a man trying to assault a fortified German position. He waited for the gun to fire. 8-second reload cycle. The crew worked with mechanical precision, machine-trained, professional soldiers who'd been doing this for 5 years. They were good at their job. They had killed dozens of men this morning. They were about to kill dozens more if someone didn't stop them. The gun fired, recoil, smoke. Mitchell started climbing. The rock face was rough volcanic stone, decent handholds, good angles. His training hadn't prepared him for this. Nothing prepared you for this. His heart was hammering. His breathing was ragged. He was completely exposed. If anyone looked out of the bunker, if anyone did a visual sweep of the cliff face, they'd see him. A man climbing alone toward their position. They'd shoot him off the rocks like he was a rat climbing a wall. The gun fired again. He was 40 yards up. The sound of the gun was louder now. He could hear the crew working. Could hear German voices shouting orders, coordinating the next shot. Could hear the mechanical reality of it. This was routine for them. This was what they did every morning. 80 yards up. His arms were burning. His legs were shaking. The hammer and chisel were pulling him down, adding weight to every movement. But he kept climbing, kept moving, kept thinking about the men on the beach, thinking about the men in the landing craft, thinking about the men still waiting offshore, watching their comrades die. 120 yards. He could see the top of the bunker now, the barrel of the howitzer, the muzzle pointing down at the beach. There was a vent cover, a machine gun position, a slit where they dumped shell casings. There was no clear way inside. The gun fired again. 10th shot. Mitchell was 150 yards up, hands bleeding from the rock, shoulders screaming, legs barely responding, but he kept moving. Kept climbing toward the German position with the hammer and chisel and 17 rounds of ammunition and the absolute certainty that he was about to die. He reached a small ledge 300 yards up the cliff. The bunker entrance was 15 yards ahead, cut into the rock, reinforced with concrete and steel plates. There was a slit for observation, a firing port, a small opening where supplies could be passed inside. No windows, no other exits he could see. Just one way in and one way out, and every German soldier in the southern European theater knew that. Mitchell crouched on the ledge, breathing hard, trying to slow his heart rate, trying to think through what came next. He had grenades. He could throw them through the observation slit. But grenades inside the bunker wouldn't destroy the gun. The bunker was built to protect the gun from grenades, from artillery, from bombs. Grenades would concuss the crew, grenades might stun them, but the gun would still be operational. The crew could get back to work in minutes. He needed to damage the gun itself. The breach mechanism was the vulnerability. The barrel was the vulnerability. The ammunition handling was the vulnerability. But all of it was inside a concrete bunker he couldn't enter. Mitchell looked at the observation slit. It was small, maybe 18 inches wide, 24 inches tall, big enough for a rifleman to fire through, not big enough for a man to fit through. But he could get his arms in, could reach inside, could feel around. The gun fired again. 11th shot. Mitchell moved. He covered the 15 yards in a crouch, staying low, not using the switchback path that would slow him down, would put him in the open. Instead, he moved along the cliff face, hand over hand, using the bunker's shadow for concealment. German soldiers inside were focused on the beach, on the gun, on loading the next round. They weren't thinking about their blind spots, weren't thinking about a single American climbing their cliff. Mitchell reached the observation slit. He could see inside. The bunker was larger than he'd expected, 12 feet wide, maybe 15 feet deep. The gun was positioned toward the front, barrel poking through the firing port. 4 Germans were working the gun. A 5th was standing near the ammunition pile, directing traffic. The gun captain, the senior NCO. All of them had their attention on the weapon, on the shells, on the next firing sequence. Mitchell unslung his rifle, reached it through the observation slit. The barrel fit. The stock didn't. He angled it, tried different positions. Finally managed to get the barrel far enough inside to aim at the ammunition pile. He couldn't see the front sight clearly, couldn't aim with any precision. Just pointed the general direction toward the shells and fired. The round hit a shell crate, didn't detonate, just splintered wood, scattered ammunition. But it created chaos. Shouting, confusion. The gun crew stopped what they were doing. The captain started moving toward the ammunition, started yelling in German about what had happened, about checking for damage. Mitchell fired again. The second round hit the gun captain. The man went down. Hard to tell if he was dead or wounded. Didn't matter, the crew's attention was broken. They weren't focused on the gun anymore. They were focused on the shooting, on where it was coming from, on the fact that someone had gotten inside their position. The gun crew made a tactical decision that probably saved Mitchell's life. Instead of trying to fix the gun, instead of trying to return fire, instead of trying to understand what was happening, they abandoned the position. All 4 of them ran for the rear of the bunker, looking for an exit, looking for the tunnel that would lead them back into the German defensive network. They didn't know it was 1 American with a rifle and no ammunition left. They just knew they were under fire inside a concrete box and they wanted out. Mitchell heard them running, heard the rear door open, heard German voices shouting from positions deeper in the cliff. The gun crew was retreating to secondary positions, regrouping, preparing for a counterattack. Mitchell had maybe 30 seconds before they came back. He pulled out the hammer and chisel, reached through the observation slit, aimed for the gun's recoil system, the hydraulic mechanism that controlled the gun's backward movement. It was the weapon's vulnerability. Without proper recoil, the gun would be impossible to control, impossible to aim. He swung the hammer. The sound of metal on metal echoed through the bunker. He swung again. The recoil cylinder crumpled. One more swing. Hydraulic fluid sprayed out, hissed, started leaking across the bunker floor. Mitchell heard voices. Close. German. Multiple men. They were coming back. He threw a grenade through the observation slit. Underhand, hard. The explosion detonated inside the bunker. Shrapnel flew everywhere. Dust filled the space. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the voices again. More men, more Germans. They were organizing. They were going to try to retake the position from inside their own bunker. Mitchell dropped his empty rifle, drew his combat knife. There was only one way this ended now. Only one choice left to make. The gun was damaged, but not destroyed. The crew was scattered, but not defeated. The position was breached, but not secured. And German soldiers were coming down the tunnel toward the observation slit, coming to kill the American who'd done this. Mitchell climbed through the observation slit. It was tighter than he'd expected, shoulders scraping concrete, head bouncing off the ceiling. His body was larger than the opening was designed for. He had to twist sideways, had to use his arms to pull himself forward, had to squeeze through an impossibly narrow space while German soldiers were running toward him from the darkness. He landed hard on the bunker floor. The air was thick with dust and cordite smoke. He could barely see, could barely breathe, could hear German voices getting closer. Multiple men, armed, angry. Mitchell stood up. Knife in his right hand, the gun was in front of him, massive and metal and wounded. The breech was open. A shell was halfway loaded. The recoil system was leaking fluid across the floor, but it could still fire. With a crew, with desperate men willing to risk it, that gun could still fire. The first German appeared through the smoke, young, maybe 19. He had a Luger pistol and a look of complete shock on his face, a moment of hesitation. That moment was everything. Mitchell moved, the knife came up fast, the German fired the pistol, missed. Mitchell's knife found his shoulder. The German went down. Not dead, wounded, screaming. 3 more Germans came through. They saw their wounded comrade. They saw Mitchell covered in blood, American uniform torn, face wild. They made the calculation that soldiers had been making since the beginning of this war. Was this position worth dying for? Was this gun worth their lives? They turned and ran. Mitchell was alone in the bunker again, alone with the howitzer and the shells and the body of the gun captain and the blood on his knife and the knowledge that the gun could unfire anymore. Not today, not with the recoil system destroyed, not with the crew scattered, not without time to repair it, and time was the one resource the Germans didn't have. He moved to the firing port, could see the beach, landing craft were coming in, more men, more equipment. The beach was still taking occasional fire from other positions, but the Mark VI was silent. The massive howitzer that had been slaughtering men was now just a broken piece of metal in a concrete box. Mitchell heard voices outside. English voices, American voices, his own infantry moving up the cliff, securing the position now that it was breached. He'd done enough. The gun was damaged beyond quick repair. The crew was gone, the beach was opening up. He climbed back through the observation slit, fell on the other side. His strength was gone, his hands were shaken. His mind was just starting to process what he'd done, what he'd seen, how close death had come and passed and come again. The first American soldier to reach him was a lieutenant named Corso. Corso had 18 men behind him, rifles ready, expecting a fight. Instead, they found Mitchell sitting on the cliff ledge, blood running down his arm, uniform shredded, eyes staring at nothing. "You get the gun?" Corso asked. Mitchell nodded. "How many Germans?" "I don't know, 7? 8? You got 7 or 8? Corso looked at the bunker, looked at the gun visible through the firing port, looked at the observation slit that was way too small for a man to fit through, but apparently one American had managed it anyway. "Most of them ran," Mitchell said. "The gun's damaged, the recoil system." Corso sent 3 men into the bunker to finish securing it. They came back out within minutes. The position was clear. The gun was damaged. The ammunition could be salvaged or destroyed, depending on what command decided. By 0730, the position was American. 30 minutes after Mitchell had started climbing the cliff, 17,000 men were on the beach. Landing craft were coming in unopposed. The German defensive line had collapsed because one gun went silent. Mitchell was sent back to the beach for medical treatment. The wound in his shoulder was deep, but not arterial. The cuts on his hands were bad, but would heal. Shock was setting in. He could feel his mind trying to escape, trying to pretend that none of it had happened. He'd been in combat for 45 minutes, had killed maybe 8 Germans, had damaged a Mark VI howitzer with a hammer and chisel, had somehow survived climbing a cliff face under fire, breaching a fortified position alone, and walking out the other side breathing. As they carried him down to the beach on a stretcher, he watched more landing craft coming in, watched engineers unloading equipment, watched soldiers moving inland, watched the operation that had been dying in the waves just 30 minutes earlier, now accelerating, building momentum, turning into a victory. The gun that would have stopped it all was silent, damaged beyond quick repair. The crew was scattered, the position was captured. 17,000 men were coming ashore because Mitchell had decided that one gun was worth climbing a cliff for, worth risking his life for, worth everything he had. The Medal of Honor recommendation was straightforward. It detailed the tactical situation, the gun, the impossible approach, the solo action inside the bunker, the results. It went through channels, division, corps, army. Everyone agreed. This was gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. Mitchell received the medal from General Mark Clark himself in a ceremony in Sicily 2 months later. His mother flew over for it. She'd buried one son in the Pacific. She'd almost buried another in Italy. She held the medal like it was the most fragile thing in the world. 17,000 men landed that day. Most of them made it home. They lived full lives. They had families. They had careers. They had ordinary Tuesdays and normal Thursdays and boring Sundays with their wives and children. None of them knew about Mitchell. None of them knew about the gun. None of them understood that they were alive because one man decided a damaged howitzer was worth dying for. Mitchell recovered from his wounds, stayed in the Army, served through Korea and into Vietnam, retired as a major at 52 years old, went back to Philadelphia, lived quietly, didn't talk about the war much, didn't talk about the cliff or the bunker or the gun. He died in 1998. He was 78 years old. The newspapers called him a war hero. His family knew him as a man who woke up screaming some nights and wouldn't say why. a man who always sat facing the door, a man who understood, in a way that nobody else could, what it cost to hold an operation together when everything was falling apart. The Mark VI Howitzer was recovered the following week. German Army records showed it had been built in 1942, serial number still visible through the damage. The gun had killed maybe 200 men in the Tyrrhenian Sea. It had wounded another 100. It had nearly stopped an entire invasion. Now it was just metal, damaged metal, stripped of ammunition and transported to an Army ordnance depot. Eventually, it made its way to the Smithsonian. Mitchell visited it once in 1975. He stood in front of it for a long time, didn't say anything, just looked at it like he was trying to understand how something that had nearly killed him had become just another historical artifact. He walked out without talking to anyone. The beaches of Pozzuoli became American that day. Engineers moved in, supplies started flowing. The operation to advance on Naples accelerated. Within 3 weeks, the city had fallen. The German defensive line retreated north. The invasion was succeeding. None of it would have happened the way it did if the Mark VI had kept firing. All of those men on the beach, all of those soldiers moving inland, all of those supplies being unloaded and distributed, they existed because Mitchell had climbed a cliff and broken a gun with a hammer and chisel. This is what people don't understand about wars. The cost isn't just measured in bodies, it's measured in what never gets to exist. Futures that don't happen, children that are never born, lives that are saved, and then continue for another 70 years, 80 years, however long they're lucky enough to get. Mitchell was 24 years old on that beach. He had been alive for 8,776 days. 17,000 men owed their lives to what he did in one of those days. One day, out of 8,000, one choice, one impossible climb, one gun. It changed everything. Everything else was just what happened after.